have a goodness, and I hope you won't let it go. You have a goodness, and I hope you won't let it go. When my heart's around yours, it's a little more grounded. When my heart's around yours, it's a little less hounded. You have a sweetness, and I hope you won't let it go. You have a meekness, and I hope you won't let it go. When my heart's around yours, it's a little more grounded. When my heart's around yours, it's a little less hounded. You have a goodness, and I hope you won't let it go. You have a goodness, and I hope you won't let it go.
Good morning, Nexus, and welcome to another Sunday morning online. And I'm so pleased that you're joining us. I'm feeling good this week. I don't know, something about fall that just, I love. So I'm feeling good this morning. And we are wrapping up this morning our short series on our collective practices here at Nexus. We're at our final one. Next week, we are moving on to, I'm excited, some fun stuff coming up. But for this morning, our final practice here at Nexus, and it's all about generosity. Here's what our practice says. We are striving to live generously. We want to practice receiving all of life as a gift, believing all good things to be gifts from God. As such, we practice traveling the path with open hearts and hands, ready to receive, but also ready to generously give to others from what we have been given, whether it's our time, money, energy, resources, or capabilities. Now, this is certainly something to strive for, and I hope you've noticed throughout all of our practices that all of them are predicated by that word strive. These are things we are striving towards, not things we've arrived at yet, things that we are working on, working towards. I'll confess straight up that I think of all of the practices, I think this one is the most difficult, at least for me. It's hard for me to get my mind around all of these things because being generous is not always easy, right? And why is it? Why is it that it's so hard to be generous with our time, our money, our energy, our resources? Why is that so difficult? Well, I want to offer us a clue here, and it comes from the Apostle Paul. He's writing to a church in Rome, right? The biggest city in the world at the time, writing to the church there, and he offers us up this interesting clue, this interesting play on words. This is from Romans 12. He says this. So, my dear family, this is my appeal to you by the mercies of God. Offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. Worship like this brings your mind into line with God. What's more, don't let yourselves be squeezed into the shape dictated by the present age. Instead, Be transformed by the renewing of your minds so that you can work out what God's will is, what is good, acceptable, and complete. Now, this language is incredibly interesting to me. I love the wordplay here. Don't let yourselves be squeezed into the shape dictated by the current age. And what Paul is telling these Roman Jesus people is that there are forces within their present age that are trying to squeeze them, mold them into a particular shape, mold these people so that they live a certain way, so that their identity becomes a certain thing. And he writes to them to encourage them to resist this enforced conformity, you could say. And Paul, of course, understood the Jesus path as a resistance movement. It was to resist being molded into the shape of things dictated by the current age and empire that they happen to be living in. And of course, I love this image and metaphor. They're being squeezed into shape and they need to resist. Friends, hypothermia is a real thing, and when you are tasked with heading to the depths of a Muskoka lake, it's a very real possibility. Those are cold waters up there, and one such day a few summers ago, it was my mission to descend into the depths of Lake Cache, one of Muskoka's most beautiful lakes in my estimation. And the problem was this: you see, my father-in-law, he had been in the water, lost his watch. It had fallen down into the depths of the lake, and he was distraught. He wanted his watch back, but he couldn't get it. Who could help? Who could rescue this watch? And of course, I volunteered, but I knew as soon as I volunteered that on my own, I would not be able to do this. I would need some protective gear. And so my father-in-law offered me his wetsuit. Now, you have to understand, my father-in-law is about 140 pounds soaking wet, which is, just a shade lighter than I am. Anywho, he gives me his wetsuit, and it's tight on him. So me getting into this thing, I'm in the room, I'm changing into it because I got to head to the depths, and I suddenly realized this is not natural, what I'm doing here. This is, I am trying to get into something that doesn't fit my body type, and yet I would not have no for an answer with this wetsuit. And so I struggled, I'm pulling, I'm yanking, and the whole time this wetsuit, it's so tight, it's just squeezing my body into this irregular shape. And I'm trying to do up the front zipper. I didn't know it was supposed to be at the back. Anyway, I'm zipping it up, I'm pulling, and this wetsuit is just caving in, shaping my body into that of a 140-pound man. And zipping up, I can hardly do it. Finally, it gets up, I'm in. Now I can hardly move in this thing, it's so tight, but I'm in, I'm ready to go, and I walk out, about to embark on my mission to rescue the watch. And the moment I get out into the living room where the family is, I can tell something's amiss. Kristen sort of gasped, covers her mouth like this and gives me this wide-eye look. I'm like, what's going on? I'm here to rescue the watch. What I didn't realize is that this thing had so shaped me into such a tight, confined space that the wetsuit seemed to reveal much more than many were comfortable with. Apparently, my physique, little was left to the imagination as I sauntered out in my wetsuit. Now, I did, as far as I can recall, I remember it this way, I did rescue the watch, but in that moment, I'm exposed. I'm completely squeezed into this tight package, leaving me totally exposed to the family, and all because I had squeezed into this wetsuit. It was so tight, the teeth on it were just like trying to survive, right? And there I am, squeezed into this 140-pound person wetsuit. That's not me, but I had been squeezed into it. And this is what Paul is getting at with this passage here. It's like there are cultural forces around you that are trying to squeeze you into a lifestyle, into something that you are not. It's like a wetsuit, the shape for someone 140 pound, trying to contain and squeeze someone like me into it. And so for Paul, the idea is cultural forces are squeezing you into this, but the role of the Jesus path is to help us resist. And of course, this letter was written over 2,000 years ago to a particular people in a particular time and place. And their cultural challenges are not foreign to us, but they're also not necessarily our own. But when it comes to the challenge, I think, of being generous and striving towards generosity, I think it's worth considering and question ourselves. What kind of people is our present age trying to shape us into? And that alone, I think, is a great and worthy question. We could probably come up with a number of answers, but as we think about generosity, I want to answer that question with just one thing we're trying to be shaped into. And I think it gets at why being generous is so difficult. But what kind of people is our present age trying to squeeze us into? Well, I would say this: it wants to make us consumers. Everywhere around us, we are being tempted and squeezed into the lifestyle of consumption. We live in an age of consumption where who you are depends on what you buy, or I actually think you could go further with it. I think you could say this: we live in the age of consumption where who you are depends on what you buy or don't buy. I mean, consider this. A few weeks ago, I had to return something to Indigo, a broken candle. Anyway, so I got to return it, and I have to pick up Kristen and Galt at 3 o'clock, and I haven't eaten all day. And so I got to return this candle. I return it. It's about 2:30. I know I got to be in Galt by 3, but I'm starving. I haven't eaten all day. And what is right beside Chapters, Indigo, and Kitchener? Chick-fil-A. And this is where things start to get weird for me, because in that moment, I'm thinking, what should I eat? And there's this Chick-fil-A. Now, if you aren't aware of the controversy around Chick-fil-A, well, I'll leave that to you to look up. But for some people, this is like a token, a badge of honor to be able to eat at Chick-fil-A. It says something about you. For others to eat at Chick-fil-A, it's like an abomination. And it says all the wrong things about you. And so I'm left in this situation where I'm asking myself, what does it say about me if I eat at Chick-fil-A? Which is a weird thing, because we're talking about chicken sandwiches here. We're talking about a meal. It wouldn't seem like something that's a huge deal, but we live in a culture where consumption defines who we are. If you eat at Chick-fil-A, it says this about you. If you don't eat at Chick-fil-A, it says this about you. This is the cultural environment we are being squeezed and pressed into. Every choice of consumption is not only a lifestyle choice, it's an identity marker. And this, I would suggest, is what we are all being squeezed into, whether we're aware of it or not. We're trying to be squeezed into consumers who consume as a lifestyle, but also consumers whose identity is wrapped up in what we consume. And here's my assumption about at least many of us this morning, certainly myself, many of us at large. This is the sort of sea that we're swimming in. This is the cultural shape we're being pressed into. And I would say this, I don't think most of us are just flirting with consumerism. I would say many of us are already converted to consumerism. That is our true religion. That is who we truly are. And the Jesus path for some of us is a quest to rescue us from the religion of consumerism. But what does it look like to resist consumerism? Well, I think it looks like this: contentment and generosity. Generosity as a creative act of resistance. Now, I want to show you something interesting here from the book of 1 Timothy. And Paul, of course, he's writing to a young pastor here, a pastor named Timothy, and he's exhorting him also, as well as he was the Romans, to not conform to the culture that's trying to press and shape us into certain people. And this is what Paul says here, but I want to take a little side trail, because I've talked about different Bible translations. I want to showcase something interesting about this passage. Just a little side trail, then we'll go back to where we're going. But this is what Paul says in 1 Timothy 6 to this young pastor named Timothy. Godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into the world and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. But you, man of God, Timothy, flee from all of this and pursue justice, godliness, faith, love, endurance, and gentleness. Fight the good fight of faith. Now, what the passage is saying is that the love of money, I think you could also say the love of consumption, is the root of all kinds of evil. That's what it says here. The remedy is contentment and generosity. But this is why I want to showcase why I become a little bit obsessed with Bible translations, because NIV is got a certain agenda coming to it. But listen to how N.T. Wright's version of it sounds. NIV says the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. N.T. Wright's translation goes this way. The love of money, you see, is the root of all evil. Get that? Not all kinds of evil, all evil. Or David Bentley Hart's translation. For the love of money is a root of all evils. Now, they're all sort of getting at the same thing, but each of those translations have a different sort of implication. And I don't want to dwell on that necessarily, except to say that sometimes I think Scripture is a lot more in our face and harsh than we think it is. So it's easy to sort of let ourselves off the hook when we think, oh, the love of money, the love of consumption is the root of all kinds of evil. Well, okay, I won't participate in those certain kinds of evil. But when it's the root of all evil, or a root of all evil, the warning suddenly seems much more poignant. In an age that is obsessed with consumption, where consuming is a lifestyle and a marker of identity, how do we resist this pressure to be shaped into that? For Paul, it's clear contentment and generosity are creative acts of resistance. And I would say this, I think generosity, being able to give regularly, to be able to give with joy, not out of, grumpy compulsion, but to give generously to the church, to give generously to the poor, it is an act of anti-consumerism, and I think it's integral to following the Jesus path. Giving generously is how we fight being squeezed into consumers. It's how we resist that wetsuit of consumerism confining us, squeezing us in. And when we give with generosity, we are seeking to be formed in a way as humans that doesn't leave us as these restless consumers, always chasing that next thing, the carrot of consumption. And as hard as I think it is to believe, what Jesus taught is that self-fulfillment, true fulfillment, it's not found in never-ending acquisition, but in self-sacrificial generosity. But let's be honest. We don't really believe that, or at the bare minimum, we really struggle to believe that's true. I know I certainly do. Why is that? Well, I would say this. The human condition is haunted by a fear of scarcity. This fear of scarcity, we fear there will not be enough. And we sort of, even though relatively speaking around the world, we are some of the richest people in the world, we live in this spirit of poverty, this pervasive mentality of shortage and insufficiency. And most of us, even though it's not sitting right top of mind, most of us have this underlying subconscious idea rattling around that there can never really be enough. And we know this all too well, even right now. I mean, consider some of these headlines coming out right now. They're all over the place if you know where to look for them. A supply chain crisis. I've been hearing about this in the news, and I confess my immediate reaction was, oh my goodness, I guess I should start shopping for Christmas now, right? Because I don't want the kids to be disappointed. Oh, if there's going to be a shortage, oh my goodness, what are we going to do about that? And it's one of these things where you see these ideas, supply chain shortage, there's gridlock happening. And news like this, even if just subtly, can send like these anxiety waves down our spines. And of course, I don't think I'm exactly afraid of there being no toys at Christmas. That might actually be refreshing for once, but even still, news like this makes us nervous because maybe it starts with toys, but then maybe it moves into more important or fundamental things. Maybe it starts with no toys and ends up with there being no food. And in the decadence of our consumption, we rarely think about the massive global network and enterprise that's required to feed our consumption. And we live in this fear of scarcity. And once in a while, it sort of pops out. And I think we saw a glimpse of this, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, right? Now, it started, of course, with toilet paper, of all things, being in short supply, people greedily grabbing toilet paper, right? But for those of us, even those of us who didn't go out hunting for toilet paper, put yourself back in March 2020. And that fear, like, oh my goodness, what if the shelves are bare? What if there's nothing to eat? What if things get cut off? That fear there. And I still have in our basement a box. Sometime in March 2020, I remember doing a grocery shop and just cans and cans of beans and this idea while I was shopping, like, all right, if things get crazy, I've got about a week of beans here I can eat in the basement. It's still sitting there even now. And moments like these are an unveiling. I'm not convinced that they're necessarily just these one-off crazy events. No, they're more an unveiling of our deepest fears that there's not going to be enough. You see, behind our fear of scarcity, I think, is a belief that we're always mindful of, but the belief is this: creation is a closed system. There's only so much to go around. Andrew Root, I'm a big fan of his. He's done some remarkable work on Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, released a number of books and reflections on it. And one of the things he points out about our secularism today is we believe we live in a closed system. We believe we live in what he calls the immanent frame. The easiest way to explain it is like a little snow globe here. This is my daughter's snow globe, but the way to explain is that we tend to believe that our world is a closed system like this little ecosystem is in here. Nothing gets in and nothing gets out. It's completely closed to itself. And so the reason we struggle with prayer is because praying to God in our closed system, it doesn't make sense because it has no power to affect the system we live in. And likewise, we find it hard to resist consumerism because the system is closed. This is it. Life is one big pie and nothing can change that. So you better get your piece while you can. And when we believe and actually live under this mentality, consumerism actually stands to reason in a certain sense. And this is where Jesus' stories can really challenge and push our mindsets. This is where the Jesus path really asks us to rethink everything we know. Someone recently said to me, that should be Nexus's tagline. I like it. Rethink everything. And Jesus' path, it encourages us to do that. And when we're confronted with certain Jesus stories, it really pushes us to examine our beliefs, what we hold to be true. And of course, there's one story that I think speaks into all of this, especially in a world where we're scared of scarcity. Jesus shows up on this grassy hillside to do some teaching, right? It's by the Sea of Galilee, and there's this large crowd there, thousands of people following him. And of course, this ends up being what we call the miracle of the loaves and fishes. It's one of a handful of miracles that all four of the gospel writers record. It must mean something big there. It's a miracle story that I would say is always inviting us in, always challenging us. And it's absolutely fascinating because it's a liberation story. This is how it goes down. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" Now, he asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. And Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." And notice how Philip here is responding out of this scarcity mindset. 6 months' wages? We don't have that. That's not enough to get even a little bite for everyone. Not enough. Not enough. Philip is us. His mindset is one of scarcity. Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many? And Jesus said, have the people sit down. There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. And Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. And when they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted. So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. I love that one line, let nothing be wasted. A great reminder as we are about to embark on our Zero Waste Challenge this Sunday till next Sunday. You can find out more about that in the Nexus Weekly through Melissa Bowman, but love those words, let nothing be wasted. But the bigger point of the story here is that Jesus doesn't stop giving out bread and fish to the people until everyone has eaten and had their fill. And even after that, there are 12 baskets left over with food. And in this scenario of seeming scarcity, Jesus takes one little child's lunch and he blesses that offering. And in doing that, satisfies the hungry masses with an abundant feast. In the feeding of the 5,000, it's not just a miracle of provision, it's a sign we no longer lived in a closed system universe. You see, you could picture it this way. With the incarnation, with God becoming flesh in Jesus, the infinite has made contact with the finite, with the closed system. In Jesus' incarnation, the good news announcement is that the finite, closed system of the world has been touched and opened up by the infinite. The infinite has opened the closed container of our world. The closed system has now been touched by what David Bentley Hart calls the beauty of the infinite. To follow Jesus' path is to trust that following Jesus, we are connected to the infinite. It's to trust that our lives, our world, our cosmos is connected to the abundance of God and the beauty of the infinite. And imagine, of course, this child, the only one who thought to bring a lunch. I mean, imagine his position, right? Here he is, and he at least has, in my mind, 3 options available to him. The first and most obvious is he can just be like, well, I brought a lunch, I'll eat it. The rest of you, not sure what you're going to do, but this is my small lunch, it's mine. Second, though, he could have been very industrious in this situation. Had this small boy had a sort of entrepreneurial spirit to him, I suppose you could say, he could have really smelled an opportunity here. Okay, thousands of people here, everyone's hungry. I'll sell my lunch to the highest bid. I can make some money here. He's got that option, but of course he chooses the third, to give. To give generously, not knowing what his small offering will do, not knowing what it could possibly accomplish. But I think the lesson for us in looking to this boy is simply this: like that little child, we too can afford to be generous. And so that's the challenge of this practice. It's not easy, but that is the challenge and what we're striving for here at Nexus. We can afford to be generous because it protects our souls from the pressures, the squeezing of consumerism. We can afford to be generous because that's what Jesus blesses. This child gives his lunch and it's blessed. It's this one small act, and Jesus takes that and uses that. Generosity, we see in this story, is divinely blessed action. Generosity is a divinely blessed practice. We can afford to be generous because contrary to what we fear most, contrary to what we hold to be true deep inside of us, we do not live in a closed system reality. In the incarnation, the divine, the infinite has touched and opened our closed system reality. And we can afford to be generous because Jesus connects us to the beauty of the infinite. Friends, thanks for joining us online this morning. And at Nexus, we value not talking a lot about money and not pressuring or trying to guilt people into giving. But on a Sunday like this, it seems to make sense. For those of you who are watching online, this is who we're trying to be as a community, a generous community. And that extends to those who watch and tune in live as well. We want to be generous people. And part of that, I believe, is giving to the church. And so we don't make this request often, but there are things, greater things I think we can do together. And so as we think about our future, as we look into the next few months, the next year, our next steps, Nexus 2.0, you could say, after the pandemic, we want to invite you. If you follow along with us, if you consider Nexus home, or even you just appreciate the work that we're doing here, I want to invite you to give generously to Nexus. Your support and investment means the world to us. It allows us to keep doing what we're doing. So I want to make that ask of you this morning. It won't be a habit. It won't happen every week. But if you're following along with us, we would love to have you as supporters and investors of the work that we're doing here. Thanks for listening to my little pitch there, and thanks again for tuning in. Next week, we're getting into all sorts of different things. The season truly begins next week. We've gone through the practices. Now it's time to get into the rest of what the year holds, and I'm very excited about it. So I hope to see you next week as well. Until then, go in peace.